Is the, you say it is good.
Pretend the second G is silent.
Oh, okay. Oh, those Germans. Goodsell endowed professor in the Department of Communication at the University of Illinois. He's the author of Digital Disconnect, How Capitalism is Turning the Internet Against Democracy, co-author with John Nichols of Dollarocracy, How Money and the Media Election Complex is Destroying America. And I like this. I used to subscribe to the New Reader. I don't know if anyone's ever seen that, but they listed them as one of the 50 visionaries who are changing the world. And he isn't just writing about it. He's co-founder of Free Press, a national media reform organization. Let's give a big hand for Robert.
All right, you all hear me okay? Thank you all. Yeah, I talk a lot about media and politics, but I'm not going to talk about that too much in my talk tonight. We can talk about how horrible Scott Walker is, how terrible the elections were, how miserable the media are, and what we can do to change all those sort of things in the Q&A. Actually, what I want to talk about today is got media in it, but it's a little broader. It's the first talk I'm giving on a new book I'm writing with John Nichols that'll come out in 2 years, but we're just beginning the work on it. And I just want to run some of these ideas by you, very broad ideas. It's a talk really aimed much more at your grandchildren, frankly, looking at my peers in the audience, or children in some cases, because it's the world they're about to go into that I'm describing. It's not the world all of you lived in most of your lives, which is a distant memory to the world we're in the process of entering. And it's going to be a rosy memory for those who remember looking at what we're going into right now. And the way to put it, the argument in a nutshell is that we're in the midst of stunning amounts of rapid technological change that's going to be devastating on the labor market. We all know that already. You see deindustrialization everywhere. But what has taken place in the last 30 years is going to look like child's play with what's coming up in the next 10 or 20 years. That's what I'm here to tell you. It's very depressing at that level. But that's sort of the fact, that's the overriding political fact of our times. And to put into context why this is happening, this summer I had a couple of days off, my wife was out of town, and I got one of those free internet passes to Ancestry.com. I've never done that, but I said, what the heck, I've got a day to kill. Why don't I don't know anyone past my grandparents, so why don't I see if I can find out who my great-grandparents were, and what boat they got off on from Ireland and Scotland and all that sort of stuff. So I get on Ancestry.com and I quickly find out that if you go back 10 generations, do you know how many grandparents you had 10 generations ago? 1,000. So 300 years ago I had 1,000 grandparents who all produced the 500 down to me. I go back to 1,000 grandparents. Go 10 generations before that. So now we're back to the year 1400, say. Do you know how many grandparents I had in around 1400? 1 million. You all did. 1 million. Go back 10 generations before that. Another 300 years. So you're right now coming into the Middle Ages. 1100, roughly. You know how many grandparents you have? 10 to the third, or 2 to the 30th power? 1 billion. Now, obviously, there weren't 1 billion people on Earth then. That's because we're all cousins, all of us. We're all close cousins. We're all related. You have, of the 1 billion people, several people were occupying 30 slots or 50 slots. There weren't 1 billion different humans. But the point I'm trying to make is that's the power of 2. When you double something every generation, at first it doesn't seem like that much, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32. But when you start getting up past 2 to the 10th power, 2 to the 20th power, to real numbers, then suddenly you're doubling 1 million to 2 million to 4 million every generation. That's serious numbers. That's how you end up less than 1,000 years ago with 1 billion different grandparents, 1 billion people making you here today. Well, that's, now getting to the talk. Understand that principle, the power of 2. A guy named Gordon Moore, 50 years ago, the founder of Intel, came up with something called Moore's Law. And that was that the power of computers would double every year and a half. So the generation's a year and a half, not 30 years. So basically, after 10 generations, 2 to the 10th power, computer power in 15 years, that's 10 generations, would increase 1,000-fold. In another 10 years, it'd be 1 million-fold. And 10 years after that, it's 1 billion-fold. And once you get up to a billionfold, which is where we are now, once you get to a billionfold, that means every year and a half it doubles. Well, now we're talking about doubling more than existed at all in the first 25 years. So we're getting to levels of computer power today that are simply, our minds can no more fathom it than we can compute the distance from here to a distant galaxy to centimeters. It simply boggles our mind, literally. And what that means for employment is that suddenly, with all this extraordinary computer power that's coming online, that the effects that the internet and computerization and digitalization is having on our economy is about to go to a whole different level. You know, driverless cars are the most apparent example that's coming. They already have them. And when driverless cars are here, farewell taxi cab drivers. I mean, that's why that whole new thing about amateur cab drivers is such a big deal, because eventually there won't be humans in those cars. Job after job after job is being eliminated. And those jobs that aren't being eliminated are being greatly de-skilled across the board in all the professions, and lessen the number of people you need to simply monitor computers that do the work. So our labor market is shrinking, it's stagnating, there aren't that many good jobs, and with that much unemployment, and everyone in Janesville understands this, is no need the economists to tell you, when you have that much unemployment, there's spectacular downward pressure on the wages of people who do have jobs, and there's pressure on the working conditions to make them worse, because all the management has all the leverage. The workers don't have it. So we're entering that world. We're entering a world in which there's not going to be much employment. There's the employment opportunities in the next generations. I'm not talking about 10, 20 years on the road. I'm talking about kids in college and high school today. Their world coming out of school is going to be ugly. And how we respond to, everyone says, like you were saying in your introduction, well, how come people don't understand, that these politicians are going against their interests? Well, for most people, especially young people, it's all hypothetical. They vote maybe in a presidential year, but no matter who gets elected, it doesn't make anything really ever changes. So it doesn't really goes in one ear and out the other. Unemployment has a spectacular way of getting people's attention. When you're out of work, when you're broke, when you're homeless, when you're unhappy, then politics becomes a pressing issue. And we're about to enter that period. That doesn't mean you necessarily get positive results. The last great moment of unemployment in human history was the 1930s. And in some countries, you got the New Deal. In some countries, like Sweden and Norway, you got social democracy. In some countries, like France and Italy and Japan, you got fascism. They were all a response to the Great Depression. They were very different responses. So my viewing it this way, our goal should be to make sure our response veers towards a humane, democratic, fair solution, not something that's absolutely unimaginable. But everything's in play. We're at a moment right now where everything's in play, where we're about to enter. Now, it would be one thing if this crisis of jobs and the economy was approaching us, and we had a great economy where everyone had great jobs and the incomes were growing and everyone was happy. And then we just sort of deal with it. But instead, and I think Janesville, no one needs that lesson in this town, capitalism has been on sort of rocky footing really for a few decades. We've had problems kicking in the 70s, and I think were it not for the massive increase in debt and financial speculation, our economy probably would still be slugging along. And the boom we had of the 90s was based to a large extent on speculation. That's gone now. Now we're basically in slow growth from here on out. The so-called recovery we've had is the first recovery in which real incomes haven't increased ever in the history of capitalism, when the level of employment has been much lower. The number of long-term unemployed people who've been out of work for 6 months or longer is greater now than any time since they started keeping those records. This is worse than the Great Depression. That's how bad things are. So our economy, even before you got the internet, Janesville was deindustrialized. Even before Moore's Law kicked into that second half of the chessboard to the 30th generation, Beloit was screwed over, and Rockford was too. Cleveland, Ohio, and St. Louis, and East St. Louis, and Detroit, Cleveland, where I'm from, they were all nailed to the ground already. So the capitalism was in trouble already. The huge amount of inequality we all talk about, this took place really independent of the internet. That didn't cause, that began in the 70s. That was in the 80s. You can't put that one on the World Wide Web with the internet. But what we know is what's about to come is going to make the 90s and the zeros and today look like Sweden compared to what's going to happen, because there's been such tremendous downward pressure on wages, and the great wealth and benefits that will come from this existing and emerging economy will continually flow to a very small number of firms at the top and investors. A very small number. One of the ironies of the internet is that it was supposed to be a champion of competition. That was the great promise in the 1980s and 90s. It would empower consumers and small businesses, workers. They'd have the information to compete with the big dinosaur corporations. And one of the ironies is that the internet's probably the greatest creator of monopoly in the history of the world. If you look at the internet today, due to network effects and monopoly political power, basically there are 12 or 13 companies that completely dominate it. 12 or 13. If you go down to a list of the most valuable companies in the American economy, 13 internet companies rank in the top 32 or 3 of the top 4, and they are all monopolies. In the sense that economists use the term. A monopoly doesn't mean you sell every piece of a product. You don't sell every automobile to be a monopoly. It means you sell enough of a market that you can control who can enter it and how much competition you have. You want to drive someone out of business, you just lower your price a little bit, push them out. And no company wants a complete monopoly because it wouldn't be profitable. So they do like John D. Rockefeller Standard Oil. You set your price where you get the most profits. That usually means you let some small fries stick around the edges. Even at his peak, John D. Rockefeller Standard Oil only had 82% market share, 83% market share. He never had a complete monopoly, but he controlled oil in North America. He controlled who got it and at what price, everywhere in the country. He had that power. Well, that's what these companies are like. That's the new world order of capitalism, digital capitalism. But it's not just these handful of companies, these monopolies. And you know their names: Microsoft, Apple, Amazon, Google, Facebook, Qualcomm, Intel, AT&T, Verizon, Comcast. In a sane society, those last 3 companies would all be out of business. They're nothing but parasites. They contribute nothing to the economy. They exist on government-granted monopoly licenses. They would know a free market if it bit them in the ass. They've never been in a free market. They've always had government-sanctioned monopoly privileges. That's what their whole business model's been based on. But these are the companies that rule. But what I'm talking about goes beyond that. What I'm talking about is where every aspect of our lives is digitized, and where the pressure for rationalization is such that jobs are going to be eliminated and de-skilled. And there just aren't going to be enough jobs for everyone. Now the problem also, and I think you all know enough living in Janesville, you don't need an economist to tell you this, is that when people don't have jobs, they can't buy things. And if people can't buy things, businesses can't sell things. And if businesses can't sell things, people with lots of money don't invest to make more things, because that's a stupid thing to do, because no one can buy, you don't invest. And that's what a depression is exactly, I just described that as actually what a depression is. So we're looking at a future of a very depressed economy, where what we see now would be considered pretty good. It's slow growth, increasing inequality, not a very pretty picture. That's our future. And it's going to be very turbulent. You can't predict how these things play out, but when you get into an environment with lots of unemployment and slow growth, anything can happen, and anything doesn't necessarily have to be anything good, but you can't really predict it. So, and this is the context we face, really, of faltering capitalism and these technologies, this revolution. Now, in a healthy society, you would have the government and the political system to solve these problems. The people would elect politicians, they would debate the issues, they say, what can we do so that people have income, so that people have jobs, so that a significant percentage of our young people are basically without any hope of a life in this economy. That's not an acceptable outcome. We have to do something about that. And a lot of my work has been writing about how in America today we have a situation where basically that doesn't happen. Our government is, instead of being a democracy, what John Nichols and I call a dollarocracy, where it's $1, one vote, not one person, one vote. Those with the most money have all the votes. If you don't have any money, you have no votes. And power is completely related to how much money you have. Now, this was considered sort of left-wing hyperbole for a long time, and you'd say that, even if you had evidence. But in the last 3 years, there have been 3 different sets of major mainstream political scientists at our leading university, Harvard, Princeton, Northwestern, Berkeley, Stanford, who independently have studied all the decisions made by the US government and looked at who influenced them and who didn't influence them and why they were made. And each of them, independently, quantitative studies came to the exact same conclusion, that every decision that is made by the government of the United States that has anything to do with the economy, any policy that has anything to do with the affairs of state always suits the interests of the wealthy, never the interests of the poor. Always. Politicians will always come up with a decision that suits their wealthiest constituents. Their poorest constituency have no influence over them whatsoever. It's not even a debated point now in political science. It's understood. This is dollarocracy. This is how the system works. And that's a problem for us because if we have a dollarocracy, the people who rule the system, those with all the dollars, they have no incentive to change the system. They basically own the board. The system's doing just fine for them. Hardly any taxes, lots of wealth. Now they're getting all the social programs they don't need. They don't need public schools. They don't need libraries. They don't need parks because they have private playgrounds. They have private libraries. They have kids with no public school that hit them in the butt. So, they don't want to pay for that stuff. They're getting rid of all that stuff. So our governing system is completely failing us. And this is exactly when you need, in a democracy, your system to understand the crisis and come up with policies to address it. Like we've done in the past. The New Deal is an example of when the government actually came up with some ways to solve a problem. And worked pretty well. Gave us stuff now. The success is demonstrated by the fact that most of the great victories of the New Deal are despised by the people who are in power now. They've been doing everything in their power to get rid of those victories. Social Security, labor unions, public education, accessible higher education, all those things right out the window. Now, there's a disconnect here, though. This gets to the last election last week. You would think if you looked at the way American politics is going and the governance of this country for the last 30 years, that the American people are a very conservative people, very content with the existing order of things, and very keen to have politicians who will serve the wealthiest Americans. That is the overriding goal of the American people based on their election results. In fact, what we find is that American people have not moved to the right in the last 30 years appreciably on issue after issue. If anything, they've moved to the left. Young people in particular today are far more, in almost all the polling data, self-identified as much further to the left than they've been in generations. Even going back to the 60s or 70s, we haven't seen numbers like these. Do young people tell you, in one BBC, I think it was, or Pew survey, they've do it every year. Every year it gets the same result for the last 5 years now. Young people say, which should you rather live in, a socialist society or a capitalist society? Have you seen these polls? Yeah, and usually it's just neck and neck. Socialism wins, it actually beats capitalism for people under 29 in America. They don't even know what socialism is. They have no idea what that term means, probably. How would they know? But they know capitalism. So if my choice is this thing or something else, I'm with something else. And that's only going to grow as they get more of this thing coming down the road and they don't have a job. Or the job they have stinks given their education and their talents and their goals and their aspirations. So a lot of my work has been trying to connect the fact that our people are, I think, latently progressive. There's an inchoate ocean of sentiment and interest in a more democratic, humane society. But our governing system and our election system don't reflect that at all. They affect quite the opposite direction. And I think that's going to be one of the great tensions going forward in the United States and our politics. Now, just to give an example, something that's never talked about when they talk about these elections, do you know what the voter turnout rate nationally was last week for our election? Nationally, not just Wisconsin. 34% of Americans over the age of 18 voted. 34%. Now, some of you might know that they have elections in countries like Venezuela and Ecuador. And we're told by our news media that these are horrible places. These are absolute hellholes that have no respect for democracy. And they elect governments routinely, over and over and over again, that are basically like our New Deal, like our Roosevelt, similar to that. They basically are the first governments in this country's history that have ever taken the benefits of the oil and the natural resources and kept it in the country, didn't let some guy deposit it in the Cayman Islands in a numbered bank account. First time. And for some reason, our government doesn't like those sort of governments. Don't ask me why. It doesn't I think it's something to do with dollarocracies. It doesn't reflect democratic values. But what would happen if Venezuela's government got elected with 34% of the vote? How do you think they'd respond on Fox News or the State Department if instead of an 80% turnout, which is what Venezuela routinely gets, or 70%, which is what Germany, Britain, France, any self-respecting democracy in the world routinely gets? They got 34%. We'd say, this is not a democracy. This is a hellhole. How can you call a country where only 34% of the population votes that government be representative? And then what would happen if we found out that Venezuela's politicians in Venezuela instituted all sorts of laws to make it really hard for people who oppose the government to vote? You know, white people in Venezuela couldn't vote because they thought they'd vote against the government. So they put in laws, if you're white, you've got to like jump through fire. We said, well, this is clearly not a democracy anymore. We'd have to invade that country. You laugh. You laugh. You know, when we've invaded 25 countries in 20 years, that's not a joke. We're at war with 7 countries right now in the Middle East. We're in wartime actions with. So no, but we would invade them. We'd overthrow them, literally. We tried to overthrow them before. We would literally overthrow them because they only had such a, since their democracy was such a joke. Well, that's us. That's us. That's American democracy. It is a joke. And what we find when we do the research is that people who don't vote, if they voted, and this is old, this research goes back to the 50s. This goes back to the middle of the 20th century. If people who didn't vote voted, so we had a voter turnout rate like the other countries of the world, we would have social democratic governments like other countries in the world. We would. Our voting turnout rate skews to richer people, older people, and whiter people. Heavily. Class is the #1 determinant about whether someone's going to vote. If you're in the top 10% of wealth and income, you're going to vote at 2 or 3 times the rate if you're in the bottom 10%. And there's a straight line. Every election, I do the numbers, and we do it in Dollarocracy. And so you have a very unrepresentative 34% voting. It's not a representative sample, 34%. So you get outcomes like we just had. That's what you would expect. If you had the exact opposite, 34% of the population vote, you'd probably elect a government that would be considered wildly radical. If you had 70% of the population vote, like they do in Germany or some other country, we would have completely different politics, if there were candidates to vote for. And that's another question we have to take up. Hopefully it would force the candidates to come up with a little loose set of policies in all parties. You get some new parties. We would have to change that too, because one of the reasons people don't vote is there's not a sense there's much to vote for. So what we argue, John and I, is that the solution to the jobs crisis is a political solution. Don't blame the technology. Technologies can be reformed. Technologies are malleable. You can make technology do good things. It's not locked into something. The reason why technology seems especially job killing is that it's being deployed by firms trying to maximize profits. So that's how they're going to develop it. Save money for me. That's the #1 goal. Produce more by paying less. And companies much prefer to deal with a machine than a worker. Machines don't need health care. Machines don't talk back to you, give you any lip. Machines don't get sick. Machines just do what they're told, and they're your slave, basically. And that's a dream if you're a business person, and you can do that. So that's where that's at. So what we argue, if it's a political solution, and the political system is ruled by dollarocracy, if it's corrupt, what recourse is there? And we think this is where some of the most exciting work is now being done. Developing what we call a democratic infrastructure. You know, we always understand the idea of an economic infrastructure, that to have an advanced economy, you've got to have roads, you've got to have electricity, you've got to have a heating system, a water system. You need all those things, or you can't have an advanced economy. Bill Gates has said, look, I could only be a billionaire in a country that's already rich and got an infrastructure. If I was raised in Chad or Mali in Africa, didn't have infrastructure, no matter how smart I was going to make it. You need an infrastructure to have an advanced economy. Well, you need an infrastructure to have an advanced democracy, and we've lost our infrastructure. And by that I mean the right to vote, to have fair elections, to have information so people know what's going on, to have journalism, to have political parties, to ease of entry, some accountability to people. All these things that go to make for a healthy democracy. They're all nonpartisan. There's not saying one side should win or another side should win, but just that you have some people actually have power over their lives as citizens. We've lost what we had, and we've never had enough. We've lost what we had, and never had enough. We didn't lose it by accident. We didn't lose it by accident. And in the book I wrote with John Nichols called Dollarocracy, we spent a lot of time talking about America 44 years ago, 1970. In 1970, I was 17 years old, and they did a survey of all the countries of the world. And all the teenagers in each country, they said, who are the most optimistic young people in the world about their country's future? Most optimistic. And the 3 countries that won, the top 3 countries, were the United States, Israel, and Chile. Those were the three most optimistic groups of teenagers in the world. And I was very optimistic in 1970. Even with the war, with the Black Power movement, all the demonstrations, I was very optimistic that this country was on the right path, that good things were coming in this country, that we'd turned a corner, and racism was behind us, and mindless militarism was behind us. We were going somewhere special. We're going to have a social democracy. That was my thinking. I think most of my peers sort of assumed that. We were very optimistic. And I think it was, despite all the troubles of those times, it was an optimistic period. But there was one group of people back then who were not optimistic, who were very bummed out by the way America was going. And that was the Koch brothers, corporate CEOs, who saw for the first time in their lives, going back really to the 30s, that business was not being accorded the respect they thought it deserved. That business was not running the country like it traditionally had run America. Business basically ran this country for most of our history, at least since the Civil War. They basically set the policies. Late 19th century was completely corrupt in this country, and they were used to that. That's how the government should be. Those who own the country ought to govern it. I mean, that was John Jay's famous maxim at the founding of the country. And so there was the corporate community was not happy with America of 1970. The optimistic teenagers scared them to death. And so their concern was if you went to college campuses then, people weren't studying business. People didn't have enough respect for business. They were studying history and psychology and all sorts of goofy things. And their concern too is the most popular person in America in 1970 by far, in all polls, especially among young people,